Hi there, guys. So there was two interesting and slightly related news stories on the economy today. So firstly, there was the news that the economy grew by 0.3% in the last quarter, which was slightly up from expectations, and that followed growth of 0.7% in the first quarter of the year. And then there was also the news that banks are now routinely offering 2-year fixed rate mortgages at under 5%, and that's following, numerous Bank of England base rate cuts over recent months. So I wanted to consider in this video whether our economy has actually turned a corner and we can look forward to better things coming. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's been an incredibly rough few years for this country. Probably since the end of COVID, it's just been one disaster after another, really. And it's felt like at times our economy has just been on its knees. So we've had the inflationary spike caused by the government's COVID stimulus. We had the war in Ukraine impacting energy prices. We had Liz Truss's mini budget, and we've had just an incredibly brutal cost of living crisis that has absolutely crippled ordinary people. You have to remember that high inflation affects poor people and people on moderate incomes the most because they spend a larger proportion of their income on basic essentials. So with all that said, I wanted to consider whether the fundamentals of our economy have changed now for the better and whether ordinary people can look forward with any level of confidence. So I'm going to split this up into a few different areas. So firstly, I want to talk about interest rates. So the Bank of England recently cut interest rates to 4%, and most major banks and financial institutions see interest rates falling a little bit further, possibly settling at somewhere between 3 and 3.5% by the end of 2026. So that is a huge decrease from the peak, and assuming it does settle somewhere around there, that's going to be a huge bonus to businesses who can feel more confident about making long-term plans or investing, as well as homeowners who will see their monthly mortgage payments fall. So secondly, I want to talk about inflation. So inflation in June was 3.6%, and worryingly, it has been going back up over recent months. And we also have to remember that the inflation from recent years, that hasn't gone away. All that's happened is that we have a new normal now of much higher prices. So inflation is widely expected to stay at this elevated rate for most of 2025. But again, there are reports of light at the end of the tunnel because it's widely expected to fall back towards 2% in 2026. So again, this is going to be massive for our economy as a whole because, as I said earlier, ordinary people are being absolutely crippled by the cost of living squeeze, and we need some respite desperately. So thirdly, I want to talk about geopolitical issues. So now that we've got our trade deal with the US, that should remove some uncertainty around Trump's tariffs. And both the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza seem to be sort of in an intractable sort of holding pattern with no real resolution on the horizon either way. Obviously, geopolitically, there's a lot that could go wrong at any moment, but it feels slightly different now to a few years ago, partly because, as I said, there's nothing new happening for now. We know the situation in both Ukraine and in Gaza, and neither of them seem to be changing. And then obviously I want to talk about domestic politics. So Rachel Reeves, she pushed through her tax on employers' national insurance contributions at the last budget. Obviously that was a mistake, but she's got another budget coming up, and so she's got an opportunity to do things differently this time. So I saw in the news the other day that Starmer and Reeves have already been talking about focusing their next budget on the cost of living. But then on the other hand, they've got this 40 to 50 billion pound black hole that needs to be filled due to their self-imposed fiscal rules. So I think it could go either way in terms of domestic politics. Ultimately, if they revert to what they did last year and do a load of stealth taxes on workers and small businesses, then that could just kill any positivity about the economy stone dead. So I'm going to be waiting to see if they do make the same mistake again, or whether they're going to do something a bit more progressive this time, like taking on big business, or implementing a wealth tax, or just focusing more on unearned income derived from assets. So I really think there's a lot riding on the next budget, and it could determine how our economy fares for the next 2 or 3 years. Personally, I don't rate Reeves or Starmer at all, but they're in a really interesting position politically because, as I mentioned, the fundamentals of the economy look like the best they have for years. And so they've got a real opportunity to capitalise on that, just by sheer luck and sort of timing. So are they going to rise to the challenge or not? That's the question. So my overall assessment, which is sort of backed up by the experts I mentioned a minute ago, is that we're naturally entering a more benign period for the economy. So we've got lower interest rates, lower inflation, hopefully from next year, and slightly higher growth. And those are all big positives for the economy. And that's then where politics comes in. As I said, Starmer and Reeves are already talking about the cost of living crisis. So they now need to make the right calls and help people feel more confident that they can spend. Ultimately, they need to put cash in ordinary people's pockets. It's really that simple. So I think we're really at an inflection point with our economy right now. If the Bank of England and the politicians get it right, we could start to see a much more positive picture. But if they get it wrong, we could quite easily just continue bumping along the bottom as we have been over recent years. Personally speaking, I want a pay rise above inflation, which I haven't had for probably more than a decade. And I want my kids' nursery fees to come down, or at a minimum, just stay the same. If those things were to happen, which is very unlikely, I admit, I'd probably have a bit more disposable income and I'd be much more inclined to spend. So it's really interesting times for our economy, and it's certainly not the picture of doom and gloom that you'll hear about on GB News or in the newspapers. But thanks a lot for watching, guys. Please let me know what your thoughts are on the economy. Am I being over optimistic here? Let me know. Thanks a lot for watching. See you next time.